featured guests are the members of the Ariana String Quartet.
Well, I want to let everyone know.
Yeah, can we show an example of that? And if my colleagues will just play for a moment, just the first two measures.
It was, I think, Beethoven who really, truly made the silences the most dramatic. 8 other fingers are what Julia and I do.
Julia, may I ask you, and would you play for us one of your favorite passages?
I'm a pianist.
So we have one final comment.
I am here having my coffee.
She is serious about resting. Goodbye, and see you next week. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. We're so glad to welcome you as part of our community tonight. Please note that this webinar is being recorded and distributed live stream. By entering this virtual meeting room, you give your consent to be recorded and distributed by UR Music and Arts and other third parties. If you prefer to not be recorded, please turn off your camera and microphone and or go to the Facebook Live video feed, the link to which has been placed in the chat room. For a better experience, please turn off your microphone and set your video to gallery view. Our show is supported by your generous purchases of Il Tenore coffee, which is now available for pre-order at www.urmusicandarts.com. Tonight, our featured guest is Alex Soojung-Kim Pang. Alex earned his doctorate in the history of science at the University of Pennsylvania and went on to teach that subject at Williams College, the University of California, Berkeley, and the University of California, Davis. He also served as managing editor of Encyclopedia Britannica. Tonight, we will discover what led him to abandon his promising career in academia in favor of a freelance career as researcher and consultant in a field called strategy and rest, a field that he himself pioneers. As of today, his research is presented in a trilogy of books which have been translated into more than a dozen languages. The first is published in 2013, The Distraction Addiction, Getting the Information You Need and the Communication You Want Without Enraging Your Family, Annoying Your Colleagues, and Destroying Your Soul. In 2016, the second book published was Rest, Why You Get More Done When You Work Less. And this year, in 2020, he published Shorter, Work Better, Smarter, and Less. Here's how. Also joining us tonight is Dr. Robert Greenberg, a composer, music historian, pianist, and since 1993, the #1 best-selling professor of courses made by the Teaching Company. Professor Niels Moos, director of the Opera Masters Program at the Music and Arts University of the City of Vienna, joins us, as does Professor Lino Rivera of St. Mary's College of California. Welcome, Alex.
Thanks very much for having me. It's a pleasure to be with you.
Tell us about how you made this trip. I mean, where do you come from? I understand you're in California right now. Tell us about your family, about growing up, and how you went into academia, and then you took this kind of strange detour into strategy and rest.
Sure. So I actually come from an academic family. My dad is a professor of Latin American history. My mother was a teacher for a while. My wife is a teacher still, and so it's sort of the family business. And when I was in college, I had originally planned to study engineering. However, discovered history of science, which sort of allowed me both to kind of talk about, and read about technical stuff, but also satisfied my sort of interest in history, and so and went on to do a doctorate in that. The reason I ultimately left academia after a couple of postdocs and teaching at UC Davis was, the job market is terrible. It is, it's in the United States, we have, the market has never really recovered from the quote unquote crisis of the 1990s. And so we're essentially in a state of sort of permanent apocalypse. And however, I managed to move more or less by chance into first a job at Encyclopedia Britannica as their managing editor, and then from there back to California and first at working at Stanford, and then went into a think tank, the Institute for the Future. And so since about 2000, I've been working first as a technology forecaster and futurist, and then have had the second life as as a writer. Really kind of very surprisingly putting into practice the stuff that I had studied in college and graduate school. I mean, fundamentally, I'm still asking questions about the origins of, scientific discovery or technological innovation, the ways in which technologies affect how we think about the world, think about ourselves, and trying to. And so, while I'm not an academic, I still kind of work on the same sorts of questions that interested me early, in my previous life. And then, this trilogy of books is one that started about 10 years ago, and I had the good fortune to have a sabbatical at Microsoft Research Cambridge, one of Microsoft's research laboratories, and spent 3 months there working on a project that I called contemplative computing, which was essentially exploring ways in which we can design information technologies to help us be more mindful and focused rather than living in a state of continuous partial attention, as Linda Stone puts it. Working on that in turn also raised some questions that became the foundation for the second book about rest, about the role of rest in the lives of creative and prolific people. And then the most recent book about the 4-day work week is essentially a sequel to Rest that talks about how companies can put the lessons of rest into practice at scale for everybody, and why that's a good thing and how it can help save the world. So that in a nutshell is my story.
I just wanted to ask you a quick, Alex, about this history of science and exactly what that means. Does that have to do with Newton, or does it have to do with the Industrial Revolution? What exactly is it?
Right. So history of science really takes as its subject the study or understanding of the natural world going back to prehistoric times. So, most of us work in a more modern era, and the materials are richer and more abundant from kind of the Renaissance on, and also, natural inquiry looks a lot more like science, starting with Galileo and Newton and Copernicus, etc. My own interests really are much more modern than that, and I've my dissertation was on 19th century astronomical expeditions, and so most of my own expertise is really quite recent. But I think that what all of history of science shares is a desire to understand how it is that we come to sort of manufacture or kind of create knowledge about the natural world, why it is that we believe certain things about how the world works. I mean, sometimes literally, how the universe works, or how species evolve or develop, etc. And to understand, of both the intellectual history, but also the kind of, but to recover a sense of contingency, right? A sense that, the world, our understanding of the world takes the shape that it does, not because it is an accurate reflection of the underlying rules of the universe, but it actually has a history, right? That we can recover, we can make sense of, we can see how people made intellectual or social or cultural choices that influence how we think about the world. And I think particularly for technology, when you're thinking about the history of technology or the history of things like the social sciences, this is really important if you want to think about how you can do this better in the future. Understanding that that the shape of technologies is neither natural nor inevitable nor inescapable is but the first step in thinking about, okay, how can we redesign systems, redesign social media or devices or hardware to address problems that have emerged in the course of their use. And so I think that that understanding how the world is made and how it can be made better is really what drives the entire discipline and most of us who work in it.
Understood. So I'd like to bring in Dr. Lino Rivera, who's across the bay from you, and possibly also across the bay in philosophy and not in the natural sciences. So Dr. Rivera, how do you look at that? Natural sciences do not like black swans. Philosophers generally love black swans. What's your take?
Okay, well, if I could just bring in a book that I'm presently reading, I'm sure that we're all familiar with the author Yuval Noah Harari with regards to artificial intelligence and what he said about the 21 lessons on the 21st century. I am curious, Alex, what you think about what Harari says, that we are now hackable animals, that all the information that is out there, the data that they are collecting, all these companies, the motto that the customer is always right is that has ended, because they can hack us. They know exactly what we would want, how we are going to lean towards a certain decision, what we are going to buy, what house, what kind of car, what kind of products we're going to buy. And because of this artificial intelligence and all of the data that's being collected on us, what's your take on that?
Well, I think we're moving, certainly, social media companies, big data firms, et cetera, are trying to move us in that direction. They have made plenty of strides making use of stuff like, behavioral economics, over the last 10 or 20 years. I think, though, that first of all, we shouldn't overestimate the degree to which this has succeeded, right? I think we all have we've all had the experience of buying a wallet online and then getting a lot of ads for wallets. And this is the kind of purchase that you make once every few years. And the fact that that these awesomely intelligent systems are incapable of digesting that fact should give us a little bit of pause when we think about their power. I think the second thing that we should note is that it's always important not to think about these things in terms of the technologies so much as sort of the companies and the users, right? That, this is not algorithms acting on their own. This is algorithms acting in particular ways because executives at these companies basically want to be able to pay cash for their next house in Atherton. And so that drives a whole bunch of choices that they make about how this data gets used, about sort of the directions in which their research and their development go. And so, it's not so much about the technology as it is about the people. The final thing I'll say is that this is not new in the sense that all of these behavioral triggers, algorithmic hacks, hardware elegance designed to monetize our attention, these all tap into a very deep sort of human ability to make use of technologies in a very profound kind of way, right? The philosopher Andy Clark talks about how humans have always been cyborgs. We are natural-born cyborgs who have a wonderful capacity to use technology, to incorporate technologies into our bodily schema, to use them to extend our mental abilities and our physical abilities. And the thing that's new about something like, let's say, Facebook, is not that it, that it has discovered something novel, rather that it is tapping into something very ancient. What's different is that those kinds of relationships that we have built up with technologies have traditionally been ones with technologies that are under our control, right? Sort of when you learn to use a sword or a knife or a typewriter, that thing is reliably an extension of you, partly because you can control it. What we're dealing with now, though, are technologies that are never really under our control, that are acting on both on our behalf and on behalf of, of their creators. And so that, I think, is where that really is the source of what's challenging about them. So finally, I think Harari is in a sense correct, but this is tapping into something that's that's very ancient, and we shouldn't overestimate how sophisticated these systems are at the moment.
So very good. I'd like to move on right away in that direction. Like you said, Alex, let's talk about your first book, The Distraction Addiction. Tell us about it.
So distraction addiction is tries to answer the question, how can we use technologies in ways that help us be more focused and mindful rather than perpetually distracted. This came out, and as I said, this came out of a project I did at Microsoft Research, but more generally, it was an effort to explain the kind of deep history of our relationship with information technologies, to help people understand how these relationships actually can be incredibly powerful and beneficial, and how we can kind of remake our relationships with technologies so that we recover that benefit, and start to kind of sever some of the negative connections, or break some of the control that creators of today's technologies try to exert on us.
Understood. Bob, Dr. Bob?
Yeah, I'd like to shift, if I might, towards the book of Alex's that I have read, and tell you the story of this, because then we're going to need Alex to respond. I read the New York Times book review, and then I tear out pages of books I want to buy, and I buy them, and they go on a shelf in my closet. And so I have, at any given time, I don't know, about 75 books to choose from what I want to read. And I will admit to you, Alex, and I'm unhappy about having to admit this, Rest sat on my closet shelf, unread, for a couple of years. Well, come the pandemic, none of us is resting well. And I know my traveling, my speaking engagements, my concertizing has gone the way of dial-up. We're all spending a tremendous amount of time at home, in our home offices, working twice as hard as we used to work. And suddenly a book entitled Rest had a great appeal to me. So I pulled it off the shelf this summer and I read it. And I did what I often do when I'm driving and when I'm watching the news on TV. I started shouting at the book. You have to forgive me for that. What I was shouting about were all these really good ideas, none of which I could act on anymore. We have to detach from the office. Absolutely, we have to detach from the office, but we're all working at home. So unless we're going to camp outside, we're never detached from the office. We need to take vacations. And I take one vacation a year, 1 2-week vacation a year. Well, that went. We were supposed to be in Madrid in April. That went out the window. When I travel, I love staying in hotels because it's quiet and I can do my own work. The kids are home now. 14 and a 12-year-old. By the way, you have an Elizabeth and a Daniel. I have a Lily and a Daniel. My privacy is gone. I mean, I used to at least have the quiet of the house to work in. Privacy shot to hell. How are we supposed to deal with our present reality vis-a-vis these wonderful suggestions that, frankly, cannot be acted on?
Well, first off, you're exactly right that there are some things that are really difficult to do, right? I mean, I think that taking a sabbatical anywhere is sort of, table. I personally am really glad that I managed to get a trip in February, before everything really shut down. And it's one of the things that I miss as well. I think that okay, so part of the reason that I wrote shorter was to address some of these issues. And I think that what you are recognizing is the degree to which our ability to rest in ways that are productive and fruitful depend a lot on other people, and upon, and also to a degree upon physical surroundings and circumstance. But especially for those of us who are working in offices, let's say, rest and attention and focus are profoundly collective and social enterprises, right? My ability to pay attention depends on your ability to respect my need to focus on critical stuff, and everybody's recognition that we all are better off when we carve out time both for deep work and for deliberate rest. And then I think that, and so the book very much was written with, rest was really written to make the argument about why we should take this stuff seriously, right? The science behind it, and the role that it played in the lives of like Nobel Prize winners and composers and folks like that. Putting it into practice, though, is really something that is what I talk about in the new book. Doing it today, I think that what we have learned is that stuff like sort of daily rituals and routines, including ones that that are sort of imposed on us by commutes to the office or walks to the classroom, turn out to actually have a lot of benefit in helping us structure our days and helping us sort of develop and maintain boundaries between work life and home life, which have been blown up in an era in which your commute to work consists of moving from one side of your couch to the other side of your couch. And so I think that as this goes on, I think we have to sort of learn to get better at doing things like essentially developing routines that replace some of the stuff that that were provided to us by our regular working lives and spaces, and then I think that and if we can do that, then we can begin to both recover more time for serious work, which is actually a precondition for having more time for high quality rest.
If I can just cut in here quick.
Please, yeah.
I wanted to say that we have a very nice comment on Facebook from Greg Niemchuk. Excuse me, Greg, I'm sorry if I don't pronounce your name right. And he writes, how do you find time for reading? And then he writes, deep respect for Professor Greenberg. And it's a pleasure to have you here, Alex. So thank you very much, Greg, for this comment. And so Alex, in other words, well, what are those? Like Bob said, you've got these two kids, you're stuck in a house. What are you supposed to do? How do you follow your recommendation?
Right. So part of what we do is there are kind of naturally, since both kids are in school, and my wife is also teaching remotely, there are parts of the day when everybody is engaged in class or they've got homework to deal with, or et cetera. Likewise, there are times that are explicitly social, right? Where we're doing board games or we're binge watching the latest something or other. But I think that for us, and my research in shorter indicates that the more you're able to synchronize those periods of deep work and social time, the better off you are. In places, and this is true for a couple of reasons. I mean, number one is that it avoids the kind of sort of social fragmentation and friction that comes when you are out of sync with other people, or you've got to hide away in order to do work. The second is that it helps to create clearer boundaries between work time and social time, and it also enhances the value both of work and socialization. The companies that I've looked at, some of them have really clear schedules where they do 90-minute work sprints, and then they've got 20-minute fika, right, the Swedish coffee break, or they will all eat lunch together. And part of the reason that they do that is that after a couple hours of really serious focused work, it's really nice to spend time with other people to kind of re-socialize after a period when you're ignoring the phone and you're not talking to anybody. And that actually not only makes the work better, but it also deepens social relations in the office, which I think which we all have discovered in the last few months, actually are one of the big reasons we all go to the office.
If I just want to remark about what you just said, because I by no means did I mean to put you on the spot, because clearly you have no more answers than many of us can. This book Rest was written in a world that's not the world we're living in now, and it's going to be fascinating to see how social scientists write about this period, because we've all had the rug pulled out from under us, and all those things that we considered normal turn out to be gone. For example, having lunch with your colleagues. This is the worst thing any of us can do right now, because that's where everyone gets sick. They don't get sick wearing the masks online. They get sick in the lunchroom when they take off the masks and eat together. So all of these things on which we've depended and which are recommended for a richer life, both privately and publicly, have been removed. And it's as if we're a giant petri dish right now in terms of these things. What happens when this doesn't happen, when you don't go to work, when you do lose substantial chunks of income and you have to do other things to make up that income, which is why I'm so much busier than I'd want to be right now. Just how do you negotiate in a world that's antithetical to what you do for a living? I mean, I see Stephanie Morales is with us, and she's a jazz singer, and oh my God, no one's out there singing anymore. And I know that with Niels and his students, people can't rehearse, people can't perform. Lino had wonderful trips planned this summer to coach in Europe, and that didn't happen. And so this is going to be, I'm wondering, and I shouldn't ask this, but I'll ask it anyway. Are you going to write a book in response to this period? And what happens when all the givens are removed? How do we behave? How do we respond? And are we responding well?
I think we're, I suppose well compared to what? And I think that, the next book will be the one that my agent is able to sell. So, as you know, there are always more interesting things to write and think about than you have time for. Right. So, whatever you can get. So for me, what I can get in advance for is the thing. Is the deciding factor. I think two things. Two responses. First of all, that that if you feel like you're not responding well, that's, the world is not responding well. I think we only need to look at the various halting, sort of stuttering ways in which so many governments around the world have responded to this crisis in the way that, that companies have tried to negotiate it. To see that very, very smart people are scratching their heads and figuring out how to deal with this and what it's going to mean for the future. The second thing that as a corollary of that is that that I think we should not be too hard on ourselves if we have not figured out how to do this well yet, right? And it's probably been 6 months since I've seen anyone say, during the plague in England in the 17th century, Isaac Newton wrote the Principia, which is actually, okay. I don't think anybody takes the attitude any longer that that the state we're in is one that, you know, that should naturally allow for a great flourishing of creativity. And indeed, that this is an opportunity to kind of back away from the idea that, you know, our fates as creators, as performers, as professionals are determined entirely by our own choices, self-discipline, etc. I think that one of the things that the pandemic teaches us is just how much our literal health depends upon the behavior of others, right? Okay. And that this is as true for, you know, this is as true for our ability to do good work as it is for our ability to avoid infection. So
I'd like to shift our attention quickly to, obviously we're talking about rest right now, the 2016 publication about different methods for resting, making rest a part of your life and focusing on it rather than something that happens or something that's not superfluous. So I wanted to go in that direction that you're talking about, Alex, about critical times and times when, like you said, people can't or would not normally think about resting because it's an urgent situation. Maybe would you tell us about that, the anecdote about Winston Churchill?
So yeah, you know, Churchill took naps every day. He was someone who, I mean, he started doing this during World War I when he was first Sea Lord of the Admiralty. And then during World War II, he continued this even when he was literally down in the bunker underneath the Treasury. And you know, I think, you know, we often think that the urgency of our tasks, that the length of our to-do list means that we have to put off time for rest, or that, you know, we'll sleep when we're dead, or we'll rest when we've finished everything. And of course, we live in a world in which we're never finished with everything. But I think that the lesson of Churchill is that, you know, even under incredibly stressful, challenging times, we perform better when we carve out time for breaks. We should also note as well that, you know, in contrast to Churchill, you know, Hitler spent, you know, weeks at a time, you know, pulling all-nighters sort of on you know, this amazing cocktail of amphetamines, horse hormones, etc. And so, you know, he put in far longer hours than Churchill did. And I think, you know, probably the results kind of speak for themselves.
And so, Alex, you write about it in your book, I think, so eloquently when you say, you know, it's not that, you know, Churchill was, you know, he went home. He went to the bed he had in a bunker while London was being bombed in the middle of the day, and you write that he got completely undressed, that he went to sleep, and that he actually divided his day into two. So that seems also to me to have some kind of response to what Bob was saying about in the pandemic time. That was also an emergency.
Yeah. If you go to the Imperial War Rooms, you take the tour of the underground space where Churchill worked, and and that room with the bed is still there, and it was a space where noise really carried, and so apparently people had, when you went to work there, you had to learn how to be really quiet during the couple hours that Winston was having was having his nap.
Of course, he had other habits too.
Yes, that's true.
My favorite line is, when I was young, I made it my policy never to take strong drink before breakfast. But now at my age, I never take strong drink before lunch. So he started in early in the day on his champagne.
Well, that's true. Yes,
he was a man who knew his body. That's for sure.
And Alex, maybe to follow up with Bob, rest, I don't think it talks about alcohol use, smoking, eating well. Is that also a topic? Is that also considered rest? I know that many of our participants, they are very into nutrition, and they really believe that is as important as resting is.
Right. Is it rest? I don't know. I would not define it that way. Is it good for you? I would, sort of paying attention to what you eat and so on. The answer is clearly. I think that, one of the reasons that I didn't talk about that was that, number one, it's really difficult to reconstruct people's kind of daily diets. Churchill, we know plenty about Churchill because he was so spectacularly invested in drinking really heavily for most of his life. And we're learning a lot as we, just over the last few years about the relationship between nutrition and brain science, nutrition and cognition. This is all still very much a moving subject. And I think that we still have kind of too much to learn about it in order to really build either a grand overarching theory about the relationship between like nutrition and creativity, or other kinds of ingestibles and creativity, and certainly not enough to be able to recommend to create any kind of general principles that that everybody should follow.
Understood. And maybe we could bring in right now Professor Niels Moos. He works and has worked most of his career with singers. So Niels, I don't know if you have any questions for Alex or comments. It's a very similar situation, I think, with singers. They can't practice like instrumentalists. They can't push themselves. They have to really pay attention to their bodies and rest, in other words.
Yeah. Hi, Alex. Very nice to meet you.
Likewise.
Yes, I'm a little puzzled about the whole conversation. Of course, Simon, you're right. Of course, singing is a very physical thing. And of course, you cannot misuse your voice, and you cannot sing 3 hours a day. But I think also when you talk about rest, doesn't it have to do with how satisfied you are with your whole life? How satisfied you are with your work? How is your attitude towards work? I'm always asked, and what are you doing? And then I'm always saying, well, I'm having long vacation. I've had long vacation my whole life. I probably work very hard, but I am extremely satisfied. Mm-hmm. Maybe it's and maybe I also take my rest. I also take my 5-minute snaps when I want. Mm-hmm. Probably also then much more productive after. But isn't it something we have to learn?
Mm-hmm. Something we have to learn. Absolutely. One of the big themes of rest is that rest is a skill. It's actually something that we can learn, even though it is as natural as breathing, it is something that we can learn to harness in order to do better work. Just in fact, as singers learn to harness their harness their breathing. As for the question of your first question, I think we should see work and rest as partners, right? Each one deepening and giving meaning to the other. And I think that one of the things that the lives that I've studied teach us is that, that your capacity to sort of enjoy, to put rest in your daily schedule, to enjoy it without guilt, even when you are engaged in a huge project, or you're doing something that is super ambitious, depends partly upon your ability to work really well, and your ability to get done in a day, or things that some set of things that you set out to do. Charles Darwin talked about, or one of Darwin's sons said that Darwin spent a couple hours a day in the afternoon walking around a path outside, on the edge of his property, really thinking very deeply after the morning spent in his study. And the son said, usually my dad would put down his pen and say, "I've done a good day's work." And now, which gave him permission to then go out and putter around and go for a long walk and spend time in the garden. So I think that, that the connection between these two things really is quite intimate. that the quality of each depends upon and is improved by the quality of the other.
Yes, but Alex, I also think that Darwin, while he was walking around the 2 hours, in a sense, he was also working. Of course, it matures. It matures. Yes. We know that very well from artistic processes, like how things mature. Right. And it doesn't mature only by striving. It also mature by letting it come.
Yes, I do think there is. It's actually. I think it's more useful to take a more restricted view of work, and to recognize that of course it's the case that Darwin was that part of the reason that Darwin spent time out on those walks was that it gave his subconscious an opportunity to turn over problems that conscious effort had not yielded solutions to. However, I think that by recognizing the ways in which these are also quite different activities that draw upon quite different parts of the mind, we create a permission structure that allows us to engage in what seem like at first entirely leisurely or unproductive activities, rather than locking ourselves away in the lab or the composition room and never coming out. The other thing that's important, I think, is that when you look at the schedule of really creative people, part of what they do is that they layer periods of intensive work and rest on top of each other. So almost literally going from the lab to the tennis court or wherever, which means that your subconscious is a little more likely to continue turning over unsolved problems. Absolutely. While your conscious attention is focused elsewhere. So I think that I certainly agree that that problems are being solved. But I think that, especially these days when we have so much trouble thinking of leisure as having value, when we think of, when we live in a world in which overwork is seen as a kind of, badge of honor or a moral benefit, doing what we can to back away from that, I think has benefits for us both over the course of the day and over the course of our lives.
So, I think this is something that professional musicians and any accomplished musician intuitively understand. I know if I over practice or spend too much time trying to write, it just goes, I can't get anything done.
Right.
You need to focus. You need to have your routine. You need to have your practice regimen. You can't be a professional unless you've learned how to practice, unless you've learned how to spend time by yourself, unless you learn to realize that a difficult passage today, if I work on it hard today, when I sit down tomorrow, it's going to be there, because that's how my mind works, and that's how my students' minds work. And so this idea of downtime, where you just allow your brain to process and put everything together, is, I was talking to your book. I was saying, yes, exactly.
Yeah.
But if you're working in an office and you're not in the control of your time, then it's a whole different story. And if you're expected to work an 80-hour week, that's destructive.
Yes, absolutely.
Let's move on now to Shorter, please. So this is your latest book, Alex. Tell us about this and how this relates to all of us here during the pandemic.
Sure. So Shorter is about the global movement to shorten the work week. So it looks at companies, ranging from nursing homes to design firms to Michelin-starred restaurants that have moved to 4-day work weeks or 6-hour days without cutting salaries and without sacrificing productivity or client service or other important things. And in essence, these are companies that are taking the lessons of rest and putting them into practice for everybody. And what I find there is that, across all of these industries around the world, companies are seeing that it's possible to do this now, that it's possible to do it without spending huge amounts of money or making giant sacrifices, that there are great benefits both for individuals and for organizations, and that it's and that it is, and that something that seems almost sort of utopian is actually far more accessible to us now than than we might expect. So that's what the book's about.
So Alex, just to be clear, the corporations you're talking about and the employees you're talking about, generally speaking, are all white collar workers. So these are administrators, management positions, professionals, specialists. These are not blue collar workers who work with their hands and who need that to work. They get paid by the hour. Is that correct?
No, it's not. No, this includes nurses, line chefs, auto mechanics, steel workers. So they're very, this is a blue collar movement as well as a white collar one. Obviously, it's easier to implement this kind of big change in, let's say, a company in a creative company that has very long deadlines than it is on, in a nursing home. But it actually is possible to do it in a far wider range of places than we might at first expect, for a far wider range of workers than we might first expect.
And what would the benefits, the gains and efficiencies be for those manual laborers?
So, first off, I think most manual labor, it turns out, is a lot more creative than we think. And so, the same benefits that accrue to, let's say, a web designer will accrue to, a plumber or to a carpenter. A greater capacity to recover from, from hard work, greater opportunities for things like creative expression, professional development, et cetera. And I think that the, also greater and opportunities in redesigning their work or learning ways of working more effectively that can increase autonomy, increase independence, and therefore also increase job satisfaction and productivity.
Understood. So I'd like to bring in Dr. Lino Rivera, but I also want to just make known to everybody that if any of our participants would like to ask something to Alex or to comment, they're welcome to just turn on your microphone or write a chat in Facebook, write a chat here in Zoom. Alex is here to answer your questions and hear your comments. So Dr. Rivera.
Yes, Alex, for me, going back to what we were talking before about compartmentalizing and putting a schedule of rest on top or vis-a-vis your work, my challenge with that is, yes, okay, I have set aside my hours of practice and work, and then I'm going to take a rest right now. The thing is, I can't turn off the brain. The brain keeps on moving and still thinking about those things. Oh my goodness, I still haven't solved that problem. I still haven't find a solution to this. And the brain, even though I say I'm going to rest right now, it's still grinding, and therefore it's making me very, very difficult to find that rest. So what would you suggest?
The simple answer is practice. We actually get better at making that shift the more we do it. The second thing is that the kind of rest matters. So, simply moving, simply doing nothing is generally not particularly, that's not particularly successful. What we need, actually, as Winston Churchill talked about in painting as a pastime, is a leisure activity that is as mentally engaging for us as our work, but is also quite different from it. And so, Churchill was an amateur painter of, a fair degree of skill. And part of the reason that he liked painting was that it was so different from, his ordinary life as a politician and writer and speaker. It was visual rather than verbal, etc. But he also found that in some essential ways, it was like politics at its best, because you literally needed a clear vision of what you were going to do. You needed to think about how you were going to approach this problem, just as you did, when you were trying to get a bill through Parliament. But so it was the things that he liked about that, about his work, without the frustrations. He didn't have the Labor Party standing with a second paintbrush trying to paint over everything that he had just done. And so I think that that having an engaging, compelling hobby that offers some of the same satisfactions as your work, but in a very different kind of context, it actually is a really valuable way to help you rest, to help you to help those parts of your brain shut down, and then if you practice it, then you'll get better at it.
Understood. So I wanted to jump in and say that we have a very nice message from Facebook from Professor Julia Sakharova, professor of violin and chamber music at the University of Missouri, St. Louis, who was here last week, with greetings from Julia Sakharova and the Ariana String Quartet, who were our featured guests last week. So thank you very much, Professor Sakharova. Thank you, Ariana String Quartet, and our greetings to St. Louis. So I think Niels has a question here because he's pointing at me. Please, Niels.
Alex, in the future, don't we have to encounter a completely different problem with artificial intelligence, that many people will have very much free time?
People have been predicting the crisis of leisure since the 1930s, or more seriously since the 1960s, right? That first it was going to be automation that was going to yield either mass unemployment or mass boredom. I think that we will all survive. I think also, as a practical matter, that that AI could, depending upon who it is who gets to deploy it, could either yield could yield a future in which robots take our jobs, or it could yield a future in which we use AI to automate the less interesting parts of our jobs, leaving us with the more interesting, more creative, more essentially more valuable and rewarding parts of our work.
Yes, but of course it will also take a complete rethinking of education and how this society is going to work, to prepare people for that.
Well, yes, agreed.
Okay, so Alex, I just wanted to ask you a last question. Mm-hmm. Our time is almost up, unfortunately, and I wanted to ask, so if you would speak to our participants tonight, and you would say, if they asked you collectively, what is the first step that they should take towards making rest an active part of their life, a central part of their life? What is the first step? What would you recommend?
Well, I think the first important step is the conceptual one, which is taking rest seriously and recognizing its value as a source of new ideas, as a place in which your creative mind has an opportunity to solve, to turn over and to solve problems, and as as the thing that allows us to have longer, more sustainable careers, rather than short, possibly brilliant, but also probably more tragic ones. So and then after that, I think that the second thing is a walk or a nap are the simplest, cheapest, most accessible kinds of rest that deliver quick results, that whose value we can see really immediately. And if you're at a loss for what to do, one of those two is probably a good place to start.
Wonderful, thank you. So Alex, we'd like to see how we can stay in touch with you, and we can find your lovely books. let's take a look at your website. It is www.strategy.rest. There it is.
There you go.
Okay.
I just installed a new theme a couple days ago. I'm still playing around with it. So, this is all totally work in progress. Nonetheless, it's gonna look, it's gonna look better sort of pretty soon.
Okay, so it's easy enough. www.strategy.rest. So there it is. And Alex, then our participants, are they able to contact you if they have any questions?
Sure. Well, I am Alex at strategy.rest. And then on Instagram and pretty much everything else, I am just Ask Pang, AskPang. So
Wonderful.
I've actually just tossed that into the chat. You got my email. There we go. That's how you find me pretty much everywhere.
Perfect. So we have Alex available on the internet. We have his email. So just reach out to Alex with any of your questions, your comments, and he looks forward to receiving them. So thank you very much, Alex, for this enlightening conversation and for coming here to enlighten us about rest, talk to us about all of your wealth of knowledge. Thank you very much.
Oh, thank you. And thank you to Bob and Lino and Niels for the great questions. And thanks very much, Simeon, for setting all this up. It was a real pleasure.
With pleasure, Alex. So I think we have, which I didn't know at the beginning of the show, we have a greeting from Juan Carlos Echeverri from his coffee farm. So let's take a look at this. Let's take a look at this greeting that comes all the way from Pereira, Colombia.
Hello, everybody. We are here at our coffee plantation, and we're thinking about this big issue nowadays, which is climate change and the environment. I want to ask my father what he is doing and he has done to help protecting all those natural resources while growing coffee.
En mi caso, en mi finca, hace parte fundamental de la producción de café, la conservación de los suelos, mediante coberturas y sombrío al cultivo, y la conservación de las aguas mediante guadales o bosques en las orillas de las quebradas, como es nuestro caso.
His personal approach has been always to protect those natural resources like this, protecting the soils with the coffee trees, but not only, also with the big trees so that they give shade, because we have a coffee also with shade, and protecting the waters with the forests and guaduales, which are the Colombian bamboos. They keep the water. Down there, there is a water stream that is protected through those small.
Wonderful. So thank you very much, Juan Carlos, and thank you to Mr. Echeverri, who is a coffee scientist, and that is why he moved to the coffee region of Colombia in order to help producers to grow the very best kind of coffee available. And so thank you, Mr. Echeverri. Thank you very much, Juan Carlos, our friend, for stopping by. So now let's take a look at next Wednesday. We have our featured guest, Natalia Villanueva Garcia. Wednesday, November 25th, Natalia Villanueva Garcia, music to accompany fairy tales. More than anything else, Natalia Villanueva Garcia loved Disney films when she was growing up. The sweet love stories with cute princes were nice, but it was the soundtracks accompanying them that she was really interested in. In fact, she was so interested in the soundtrack part that in 2013, she founded her own orchestra to record them, the Vienna's Max Steiner Orchestra. Goodbye, and see you next week.